Welcome to yet another Patreon video of mine. It's turning out to be every other week. That's what happens when you teach 3 classes and trying to work on books. You get a little busy. But today, our topic is the second part of the Jacob cycle. Last time, I talked about the first part of the Jacob chunk in Genesis, which takes us from the birth of Jacob and Esau in chapter 25 up to Jacob being in Aram, having fled from Esau, and he's in Aram, and he married Rachel and Leah. And that's where we left off. Now, a couple of things that that is important to realize with the overall Jacob cycle, because like with anything in the Bible, any of the narratives, you always want to look for an overarching theme or motif, or those type of things that kind of run through each cycle. Overall, the larger thing of the whole patriarchs is the covenant, a few other things. With Jacob in particular, there's this theme of deception, which I talked about last time. His very name means heel grabber or deceiver, and that kind of is who he is. If you read the Jacob cycle closely, everything has something to do with deception. And yet, the shocking point is that God is using this guy, the deceiver, to work through, to bring about his covenant, the fulfillment of his covenant. And so last time we looked at the first half of the Jacob cycle, where he was deceiving Esau to get his birthright and his inheritance, and he was deceiving his own father, Isaac, to get that inheritance. And then he fleeing Esau, and getting to Aram, and then getting deceived by Uncle Laban because he wants to marry Rachel, and he gets Leah instead, that he has to work another 7 years for Rachel. So all in all, he works for 14 years for free to finally get to marry Rachel. Now in this half of the Jacob cycle, basically from chapters 29 to 35 is kind of like, well, it's the second part. And there's a lot of fun stuff in it. Let's look first at basically 29 to the end of 29 to pretty much nearing the end of 30. Right in the middle, and if you got that chart that I sent you last time, you kind of see how this works. That first half leads into Aram, and the very middle of the Jacob cycle is this chunk of narrative that talks all about the birth of his sons. Now, obviously, this is really important because those sons his 12 sons become the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is kind of like the birth of the nation, so to speak, at this small time. And so it's a pretty matter-of-fact narrative. We learn that Rachel can't have kids, and so Leah, in chapter 29, 31 to 35, we're told about the initial sons she bears for Jacob. And then Rachel gets jealous. So Rachel gives Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, who then bears sons for Jacob. And so Leah gets jealous. So then she says, hey, no, Jacob, you got to take my handmaid too and make babies with her too. So he says, okay. So it's the third woman who bears him sons. And then one of the really interesting things that people don't get, and I'll just kind of touch upon this, is in chapter 30, 14 to 21, there's this odd story about Reuben, the firstborn, and mandrakes. It's kind of an odd story, but basically, I'll read it to you. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went out and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you rather take my son's mandrakes too? Rachel said, then he may lie with you. Rachel said, then he, meaning Jacob, may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. So when Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to him and said, you must come in to me. for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. This weird story about Reuben's mandrakes heightens this tension between the two sisters. Obviously, there's jealousy going on between the two sisters because Jacob really loves Rachel. And so Leah is feeling left out, and for some reason, Rachel really wants those mandrakes. So she's willing to trade some bedtime time for the mandrakes. And so Leah gets Jacob back in her bed, and lo and behold, she gives birth to a few more kids for Jacob. It's kind of an odd little story that heightens the tension between these two sisters as well. But then we're told at the very end of this section that eventually Rachel somehow conceives and she gives birth to Joseph, who's obviously going to be a major figure in the story of the patriarchs. His story takes up the last third of the Genesis story. But she is finally giving birth. So basically, by the end of all of this, you have the account of all these children being born to Jacob out of his marriage to not just Leah and Rachel, but his time with their handmaidens as well. In that culture, that was considered a acceptable practice. After that, then we get going to the real second half of the Jacob cycle, which will eventually end with Jacob back in Canaan. The first part is he starts in Canaan, he has the conflict with Esau, he runs away, he gets married, he has these kids, and now the arc of the narrative is going to take him back to Canaan and get reconciled to Esau eventually and have a life back in Canaan. So now we're on that path, we're starting to make our way back. And we see this in the chart in the next column, which I call Jacob and Laban. This goes from 30:25 all the way to 31:55. Basically, this highlights the growing tension between Jacob and Uncle Laban. Just like he had tension with Esau that drove him to flee Esau to Aram, this tension with Laban is going to eventually be enough of a conflict that is going to get him to flee Laban and go back to Canaan where Esau is. So again, there's this conflicting tension. Follow Jacob wherever he goes. And what we find in this column, basically it comes in three sections. In 30:25 to 43, we are told that Jacob's flocks start to increase more, pretty much because, and it's kind of an odd thing, that he has some kind of trick that he uses to cause his flocks to be more fruitful and multiplying, where Laban's flocks not so much. And it's hard to really understand. But basically, the deal is that Jacob has been pasturing Laban's flocks. They make a deal for payment. Jacob takes all the speckled and spotted animals for himself as payment, and Laban gets all the non-speckled, spotted livestock, and Laban thinks this is great. But then Jacob somehow does something that causes his flocks to procreate more. And it's kind of an odd thing. It's hard for us to understand in the modern world because most of us aren't, ancient shepherds. It says, verse 37, Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the whites of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, so that the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. It's kind of a odd thing that we can't really understand, but with any ancient society, with any society really, farming practices, or there's kind of what's the word, home style remedies that people do that supposedly work that we don't really understand. And this practice of putting striped almond branches in front of the troughs, Obviously, even though we don't understand it, it was believed to come to like inspire the livestock to procreate more. And long story short, the spotted and speckled animals produced more, and so Jacob's flocks increased, and Uncle Laban's flocks not so much. And this creates jealousy and tension between Laban and Jacob. And because of this, when we get to chapter 31, Jacob realizes this, and he decides, he tells his wives that we got to split. We have to get out of here because the tension between me and Uncle Laban, or your father, is getting too much. And so he deceives Laban by leaving in the middle of the night with his whole family. And on top of that, and this is kind of an interesting thing, we're told that Rachel steals her father's household gods, which again, this highlights the fact that obviously Laban was not a devoted follower of Yahweh, but neither was Jacob at this point. They're stealing Laban's household gods, and they hightail it out of there. And we're told eventually in the latter part of chapter 31, 22 to 55, Laban catches Jacob, and there's a confrontation, and but they get it resolved. But before they get it resolved, Laban is really upset that his household gods have been stolen, and he's sure that Jacob stole them. And the interesting thing is that when he catches Jacob, Jacob swears up and down that he didn't steal his gods, and he didn't. Rachel did. And we're told that Rachel hides the idols, these little household gods, under her blanket, and she sits on the blanket and in the tent. And so when Laban comes in to check, because Jacob has told him, hey, you can check all my stuff. I didn't steal your gods. When he comes into Rachel's tent, Rachel tells her father that it's that time of the month, I can't get up. And because of the stigma of that time of the month, Laban does not have his daughter get up so he can check under the blanket. He just leaves, and thus she is able to successfully steal his household gods. Once again, another example of deception in the family of Jacob. But in any case, after that, Jacob and Laban, they resolve their differences, they make a covenant with each other, and things seem to be resolved with them. Jacob then proceeds to continue to go to Canaan. And this is the next column that is all about Jacob's reconciliation with Esau. This is like one of the big things in the Jacob cycle. The very reason he left Canaan is because of his conflict with Esau, and because Esau vowed to kill him. So now, years later, 14 years later, Jacob is making his way back to Canaan, and this is the big unresolved question. What is Esau going to do? Because the last time we saw Esau, he was raving mad, wanting to kill Jacob. And so, what we get, this is in chapter 32, in chapters 32 and 33. Chapter 32, 1 through 21, is we find that Jacob is preparing to meet Esau. And there is covenant language going on here. Because again, this is one of the fundamental themes throughout Genesis, is how God is working through these deeply flawed people to bring forth his covenant, to bring forth a fulfillment of his covenant. And so what Jacob does is he sends ahead of him and his group, and his whole caravan, I guess, messengers with loads and loads of gifts for Esau, because he hears Esau is coming to meet him, and he's afraid that Esau is going to, kill him. And so he sends people in front of him with gifts for Esau to kind of appease him. But he still is a little iffy. He's not sure it's going to work. And so what he does the next time, in chapter 32, 22 to 31, is where he sends his family off to one place, and he goes to a different place, because if Esau is coming for him, he doesn't want Esau to kill the whole family. And in chapter 32, 22 to 31, is a very famous scene of Jacob wrestling the angel. And I think this is a very significant scene on a number of levels. On one level, I just like this story because I think it is a good metaphor or analogy for that we can take as to how we should relate to God. Jacob is not a godly person. He's a deceiver. But the thing that God eventually rewards him for is his tenacity. And this is what the story is about. We're told at the beginning of the story that a man just shows up. We're not told it's an angel, but we figure out it is. And they wrestle all night long. And this is kind of the story of Jacob his whole life. He's always wrestling with people. He's always wrestling with God, with Esau, with Laban. He's a fighter. And by the time the morning comes, the angel, the man, tries to get away. And Jacob refuses to let him go until this man blesses him. This angel blesses him. And we're told that the angel touches his hip socket and basically dislocates Jacob's hip. At the same time, he tells Jacob that you're going to have a new name. Your new name is Israel. Because the name Israel literally means he wrestles with God. Yisrael, God. And this is kind of, I think this is kind of, like I said, this is a good metaphor for following God, the Christian life as a whole. Jacob's blessing for his tenacity, for his gall to have the gall to wrestle with God, is God blesses him with the name Israel, but at the same time he dislocates his hip. And so oftentimes, I think the blessings that come from God often come with a price. And so we're told that Jacob limps for the rest of his life. And I think he gets a blessing, but he gets a little smacked. And I think sometimes that's like I said, this is what the Christian life often is. God wants us to get in the ring and wrestle with him. That's how we get the blessing, but at the same time, pain is going to be involved. You don't get the blessing without a little price to pay. And that's what we see with Jacob here. Now again, we see this as kind of it's part 2, but earlier on when he's fleeing Esau in chapter 28, he sees the image, the vision of the angels up and down the ladder at Bethel, and here he's wrestling with an angel. So we're kind of coming to a conclusion to that first half of the Jacob story. In any case, in chapter 33, we find that Esau finally comes and meets Jacob, and lo and behold, Esau, being the happy-go-lucky jock that he is, he's not mad. He's like, nice to see you, bro. Let's have a brewski. Okay, he doesn't literally say that, but everything's fine. He reconciles with Esau, but still he's going to keep his distance. He's going to move to Shechem. And it's interesting, and you see this noted in the chart, that when he wrestles the angel, he says, after the angel leaves, he says, I've seen the face of God. And then when he meets with Esau, that phrase once again is mentioned. So you see this idea that God's is at work in all of this. In any case, after he reconciles with Esau and he moves to Shechem, we're told that he buys some land from Hamor and he kind of settles. Now he's back in the land. Things seem to be okay, but things aren't quite done yet. And there's 2 more things that are really, actually 3 more things that kind of wrap up the story of Jacob. And this comes in starting in chapter 34. And this is the final major column in the Jacob cycle. Now that he's back in the land, how are things going to go? If you parallel it, at the very beginning, there was the column about Isaac's conflict with Abimelech. Here, Jacob and his family are going to have a conflict of their own. It comes in the form of chapter 34. It turns out that the leader of Shechem has a son who really likes Jacob's daughter, Dinah. And long story short, he takes her and he violates her, he has sex with her. But he really loves her, so, apparently. And so he and his father come to Jacob and they make an offer. They say, let my son marry your daughter and you will be part of the Shechem family, so to speak. And then your sons can intermarry with our women and our sons can intermarry with you. And, we could all be one big happy family. Well, Jacob's sons aren't happy with the fact that their sister was violated. And so they go about deceiving the people of Shechem. And so what they do is they tell them that we would love for you to marry our sister and for us to intermarry and everything. But you see, we're the chosen people of God and we're circumcised, and we can't intermarry with you unless all your men agree to get circumcised. And apparently, the son wants to marry Dinah so much that they think that's a good deal. And so they go back and they convince all the men of Shechem to allow themselves to be circumcised. Now, that's a price to pay, just for the opportunity to intermarry with with another group. And it's also painful, as anybody would know. And long story short, we are told, and this is just really hardcore. Jacob's sons they're not just deceitful, they're vicious. Basically what happens is the men of Shechem agree to get circumcised, and in the next few days after they got circumcised, they're obviously in pain. They're kind of doubled over in pain from the procedure. It is at that time that Jacob's sons come into Shechem and slaughter everybody. So not only did they deceive him to the point of agreeing that they get circumcised, then they get slaughtered while they're still in pain from getting circumcised. And when Jacob finds out what his sons have done, he basically says, what have you done? You're really making me look bad to the larger area. And his sons say, or should we allow our sister to be violated? They are so angry about that they slaughter a whole city. And so Jacob realizes he can't really stay in Shechem anymore. He's kind of worn out his welcome, so to speak, because of his deceitful sons. And they travel to Bethel. And this is in chapter 35. Now, this is really cool because this ties things up from the beginning. If you remember, when Jacob flees Esau way back in chapter 28, 10 through 22, this is where he sees the vision of the angels going up and down the ladder. This takes place at Bethel. And if you remember from last week or 2 weeks ago, when Jacob wakes up from his dream in chapter 28, he basically vows that if the God of Abraham, if Yahweh, eventually brings him back to Canaan and reconciles, has him reconcile with Esau and keep him in safety, that then Yahweh would be his God. That took place at Bethel. Then he goes to Aram, all that stuff happens, and now he's back in Canaan. And now, in chapter 35, he comes back to Bethel, and it's really important because at Bethel, Jacob and his family get rid of their foreign gods. Jacob is true to his word. Now that he's back in Canaan, and God has kept him safe, Yahweh has kept him safe, he is now fulfilling his word by, if you hear that in the background, my dog has decided to start eating now. Now that he's back at Bethel, this is where, in chapter 35, 1 through 15, is where Jacob truly makes Yahweh his God. And so what begins in the Jacob cycle with basically a pagan deceiver fleeing for his life and God saying, I'm going to use you, is now starting to bear fruit. Now that he's back in the land, he is now making Yahweh his God because God chose him first, so to speak. And in addition to that, there is covenant language, and this is basically 9 to 15. I'll read it for you. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be Jacob, but Israel will be your name. So he called his name Israel. That goes back to the wrestling of the angel thing. And God said to him, I am the Lord Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. That's covenant language. That echoes the covenant that he initially made with Abraham, and it reinforces the promises he made with Abraham. And this is what we see. Now that Jacob has made Yahweh his God, God once again reinforces the idea of covenant and that he's going to work through Jacob. The promises he made through Abraham, he's going to fulfill through Jacob and his line, the offspring. The end of chapter 35, we're told that he goes to then Ephrath, and we're told one last time that Rachel has one more kid, Benjamin, and then she dies in childbirth. And that is the end of the Jacob cycle proper. At the very end of chapter 35, there is this one weird short little scene that often gets overlooked, but will come into play later on. We're told in 35:21 that Reuben, the firstborn, now he's an adult, apparently sleeps with Bilhah, who is one of Jacob's concubines, Rachel's concubine. Not Rachel's concubine, Rachel's handmaiden, who is Jacob's concubine. And apparently Reuben slept with her. Now this is seen as a huge, what's the word? Not a good thing to do. You don't sleep with your dad's concubines. And because of that, Reuben is basically maligned and shamed, and he's kind of in Jacob's doghouse. And this is really important to realize for what comes next in Genesis. But Reuben is the firstborn. He is, in line to get the inheritance of the firstborn. But because he sleeps with Bilhah, he's probably not going to get it. He's, like I said, he's in Jacob's doghouse, and that plays a role for something that comes in a few chapters. Chapter 36 is just a genealogy of Esau's lines. But after that, this is where we get to chapter 37, and this begins the last cycle of stories in Genesis, and this is the Joseph cycle. And in a lot of ways, the Joseph cycle is well known. Everybody knows the story of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, or a version of that. But what I want to do next week is, give a brief overview of the story. Most people know the story, but I want to point out a couple of very interesting things in the story that I think are worth noting and that will make understanding the story as a whole much more interesting and meaningful. So we'll do one more week of the Genesis stuff, and then after that, once we get through Genesis, I will choose another biblical book to take us through, and we'll go from there. So hopefully you like this. Take time to, now that I've talked about all this, take time to read the whole Jacob cycle from chapter 25 to 36. Just read it in one sitting and look at how many times the idea of deception comes up and the idea of covenant comes up, and that whole arc of the narrative of Jacob starting off as a pagan, ending up with being a Yahweh worshiper. I think you'll see a lot more going on in that story that you can appreciate. All right, thanks.